Violent crime is escalating all across every segment of society at a dizzying rate. And much of it is dramatically influenced by what comes into our living rooms under the guise of entertainment. Is it time we faced the truth? 14-year-old Rod Matthews wasn't interested in baseball, but he found a chilling new use for a baseball bat. He used it to batter a young friend to death after luring him into the woods. Rod had just watched a rental video, Faces of Death, a collage of film clips of people dying violently. And he wanted to see how it worked in real life. At the trial, a child psychiatrist testified that Rod was not conventionally insane. He just didn't know right from wrong. He is morally handicapped. Remember Jeffrey Dahmer? He also feasted his eyes on the autopsies, dismemberment, physical cruelty, human combustion, and electrocution found in this video just before slaying his second victim. The media has always had a fascination with blood. But cinematic violence took a dramatic new turn back in 1960 when the thick red liquid first ran down Janet Leigh's leg in the shower drain before the eyes of millions of horrified viewers in Alfred Hitchcock's precedent-shattering movie Psycho. Of course, it was all in good fun. It wasn't real. But that movie formed one of the tributaries of a river of blood-real bloodshed by unstable minds influenced by what they saw on the screen. Psycho went on to become a much imitated classic. Today it's called a masterpiece. But it was initially greeted with a storm of critical opprobrium. The reviewer for the London Daily Express called it a cesspool. The most chilling accolade came from two young murderers who confessed that it was repeated viewings of Psycho that inspired their crimes. Well, Alfred Hitchcock was less than sympathetic. "These boys have killed before," he said. "I want to know what movie they saw those times, or did they do it after drinking chocolate milk?" Well, since that time, countless other studio spokespersons have continued to just miss the point. No one claims that such movies are the sole cause of a crime. They are a contributing factor. Millions of people watch the Super Bowl ads and commercials showing Hollywood actors eating nachos. No, they do not buy nachos on their next trip to the store, but thousands do. It is impossible to estimate how many brutal slayings have resulted from the genre of imitative slasher movies that followed Psycho. For the vast majority of murderers do not own up to their crimes. For every confessed movie murderer, there could be hundreds of others. And yet we now have the record of scores of ruthless criminals who have confessed their partnership with Hollywood. Consider the case of Kathleen Pearson, stabbed to death in her Chicago apartment by Jeffrey Gurga, a former assistant state attorney in Illinois, who was simply acting out fantasies based on violent scenes found in videocassettes. Or Sharon Gregory, slashed to death in Massachusetts by a young man who believed he was Jason, star of the Friday the 13th horror film series. Or 17-year-old Kathy Ann Petruso of North Salem, New York. Having watched An Officer and a Gentleman several times, Kathy hanged herself following an argument with her boyfriend, just like in the movie. Her boyfriend followed suit a few weeks later. Television is the most potent persuasive force and shaper of thought in America and Canada and the world today. Robert McNeil estimates that the average watcher spends 10,000 hours in front of the television set for each decade of life. 10,000 hours. That's enough time for a high school graduate to earn his PhD. And during those 10,000 hours, the viewer is being programmed to accept violence as a ho-hum, humdrum fact of life. Listen, the power of the film industry to influence behavior is legendary. A classic example. In the 1934 film, It Happened One Night, Clark Gable took off his shirt to reveal that he was wearing no undershirt. And the sale of undershirts plummeted. When the Fonz got a library card in one episode of Happy Days, thousands of children did likewise, something network officials were quick to take credit for. The movie Top Gun brought thousands of new recruits into the Navy. It has also been blamed for setting the stage for the tailhook scandal, in which unwilling young female recruits were groped by macho Navy flyers. Millions of dollars are spent for television advertising on the premise that people will copy what they see other people doing on the screen. When President Clinton played his saxophone on television, the sale of saxophones went up. Yet those who produce violent films and television programs deny that their work influences people to behave violently. Research indicates otherwise. University of Illinois professor of psychology Raoul Huesman found that adults who had been convicted of the most serious crimes were those who had watched the most television violence as children. After reviewing 2,500 such studies on television violence, the National Institute of Mental Health stated that there is, quote, overwhelming evidence that television violence leads to aggressive behavior in children and teens. Studies show that even momentary, casual reports of violence can affect listeners' behavior. Some researchers dropped wallets filled with money on the streets of downtown New York over a period of time to find out just what percentage of the population was honest enough to mail the wallets back to the address found inside. They discovered that a consistent 45% of the wallets were returned to their fictitious owners. However, one day a strange thing happened. On June 4, the day that Robert F. Kennedy was shot, not one of the wallets was returned. The researchers decided that the news of Sirhan Sirhan's treachery had a demoralizing effect upon the population. They devised an experiment to test their theory. They found a number of people who agreed to take part in an experiment that involved taking several batteries of tests. They were asked to wait one by one in a small room before being called in for testing. What the volunteers did not know, they weren't told, was that the waiting room was part of the experiment. A radio speaker on the wall of the room played soft background music. The participants were not told to listen to the radio. However, after each volunteer had been sitting alone in the room for only a few moments, the music was interrupted by one of two phony news bulletins. Half of the volunteers heard a story about how a brave young man had risked himself to save someone else from disaster. And the other half heard a story about how a trusted friend had cruelly betrayed a friendship. You know what happened? Several minutes after the music had resumed, the volunteers were called into the testing room, administered a battery of tests, and asked to cooperate in performing certain tasks. It was found that those who had heard the negative, demoralizing news bulletin were less cooperative and more competitive, while those who had heard the positive news bulletin were more cooperative and more productive in their assigned tasks. Now, amazingly, the results held true whether or not the volunteer remembered hearing the news bulletin. Listen. Doesn't the Bible say over here in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7, "As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he"? If a single, brief, unemotional report of treachery can move normal people to behave in an antisocial manner, then how much must repeated, dramatized reenactments of the most horrible crimes influence borderline psychotics? Over and over it happens. Heinous crimes are tied to hideous movies. Shortly after hikers found the burned body of Daniel Allen buried along a railroad track, police found the detailed plan of his murder: shoot him, burn, then bury him, in his daughter's diary, along with a note about watching a pretty cool movie called River's Edge, based on the true story of a teenage boy who murders his girlfriend and whose friends keep his secret while her body lies by a river. You know, my files are full of such horror stories. They're not rare. How long will we ignore this book? How long will we wink at degrading entertainment because we enjoy it? How many Ted Bundys must confess the source of inspiration for their atrocities before we believe? How many innocents must rise up, die, before we rise up in outrage and put a stop to the horror? How long must the bloody river flow? You may not be able to control what comes out of Hollywood, friend, but you can control what comes out of you. If the communication of evil begets more evil, as we have seen, then consider how important it is to follow Paul's advice over here in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 29 to 32. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ in God forgave you. It's time we faced the truth.